On the ExpertsConnect podcast, we have thought-provoking conversations with top-performing experts on topics that matter to you. With ExpertsConnect, you'll uncover fascinating facts and gain the necessary skills you'll need to improve all aspects of your life. Today, Kwaku will be talking to us about incorporating virtual reality in the classroom. Kwaku Aning is an educator, a professional wanderer, a connector, an advocate for students looking to connect the dots between education, tech, art, agency, and the stuff that he's yet to understand. Currently, Kwaku is the director of the Center of Innovation and Entrepreneurial Thinking at the San Diego Jewish Academy, but has had the privilege to work in various roles within the public charter and private schools over the past 19 years within education. In his current and previous roles, he has had the privilege to work with students on various team and project-based learning projects utilizing robotics, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality, and projection mapping. One of the highlights of this work occurred in the fall of 2017 when he produced 4 short 360 video documentaries for the United Nations on Fijian youth and the effects of climate change. Hi, Kwaku. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful, thank you. So, can you tell us what is virtual reality?
Well, virtual reality is, I'm trying to think of the easiest way to describe it. It is basically using technology, a headset, to completely cut yourself off from the world that you're in and then having another world visualized in front of you.
Interesting. And you've been using virtual reality in your own classroom. Can you give us examples of how you're using it with your students?
Well, I've been using it for the past 5 or 6 years in a bunch of different ways. Initially, I worked on a project with students where I had them build out their own virtual reality game based upon photosynthesis, which they based upon another game that they played in VR. But the real, I guess, the real meat of the project was that they chose the topic and did all the research, including interviewing teachers, and also did sort of like a test version of it and received feedback from students who were playing it. And then most recently, I've been working with one student who is building out her own VR experience to help people get past phobias.
Hmm. Interesting. So, can you share a bit more about the students' experience as they used VR to understand photosynthesis?
Well, it was great because initially what the students would do is they would, I just sort of gave them the opportunity to play in VR and just experience it. And they went through this process where they learned about the design aspect of whether it be experience building, game building, that sort of thing. And then they sort of combine that with essentially trying to achieve the things that they enjoyed within VR, while simultaneously teaching people how to problem solve within VR.
Interesting. And I'm curious because you mentioned that you have a student helping people to get over their phobias, but can students also learn empathy by using virtual reality in the classroom?
Well, it's a good question. I think that's the root of the current students project, which I don't want to go too far into because she's pretty excited about it, and I think she might try to turn it into a business at a certain point. But the power of VR is the idea of being transported to another place or being able to feel something in a way that you couldn't feel it in the real world, in the way that you not even feel it, but you would have the opportunity to feel in the real world. And that is centered in being able to empathize with another perspective.
Nice. So, did your students have any? Okay, so let's not talk about the one with building the phobia app, but
Mhm.
did you have any students building any VR applications to learn empathy in your own context?
Yeah, I worked on a project with students a few years ago where we partnered with a children's hospital, and the students had to basically answer two questions. One, the effect of this hospital on the nation. It's a national hospital chain. It was St. Jude Children's Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. And then two, the effect of that hospital on children's cancer. And so a big part of that was that the students interviewed a former cancer patient and then the parents of a child who was diagnosed and is in recovery from cancer, and they had to essentially create an experience from the perspective of the combination of these two people to demonstrate the effect of this hospital on helping children with cancer, and all of that was rooted in empathy.
Lovely. And how did they experience it? Were they more empathetic towards the parent and the person with cancer?
Yeah. Well, through sort of storyboarding the experience that they wanted other people to go through to sort of empathize, but also get a sense of what it feels like to be battling cancer. That sort of empowered the students to take on that perspective and make them more empathetic, and literally try to get into the shoes and ask questions of people who've gone through these struggles so that they could come up with a virtual experience that sort of described that in an allegorical way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And how can virtual reality prepare students for their future?
Well, I'd like to think that there's going to be a confluence of a few things. One, the price of VR just in the past 5 years has come down so much, and then with the prospect of 5G, it will be easier to use VR in a lot of other instances, which makes it a powerful tool and skill set that will be utilized in a lot of different fields. Currently, it's being used minimally in education, gaming, but there are a lot of healthcare applications that have been developed for it, in addition to financial. So, I mean, there workplace training, whether it be from police to military to Walmart. And there's going to be a need for people who can create that content, and so as a result, the earlier students learn about that process. And not just the experience of using VR, but the design process around that, and how to really utilize the medium to help people to learn. The earlier learns that, the more valuable they'll be in the workplace in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I totally agree. But could you dive a bit more into the design process surrounding virtual reality applications?
Well, the design process, I think, is very similar to the design process for um, a variety of things, whether it be filmmaking, storytelling, essentially at its core. Ideally, when you're making a film or you are shooting a series of photographs, you have a fixed lens that you work with. And then if you were doing something, let's say a 360 video or an animated VR piece, you do not have a fixed lens. Essentially, your viewer, your participant, can be focused on anything. And so, as a result, the idea of how to tell a story without being able to control where your participant is viewing is a really specific challenge and skill within design, and the idea of also combining the right cues and also making sure that the perspective that you're creating is authentic enough to produce the empathy which will also lead to the cognitive piece of being able to retain a new skill or story. And then finally, there's the haptic part. There is a ton of research around how haptic activity or motion within learning helps to reinforce that process and build the schema that's needed to take something from your short-term memory into your long-term memory.
Yeah, interesting. And let's dive a little bit into the challenges that we can experience employing virtual reality in our classrooms. So I can imagine that when you introduce virtual reality in the classroom, the students get very excited, right? But what happens when the novelty effect wears off with VR in the classroom?
Well, to be honest, I kind of want the novelty effect to wear off, because it's at the end of the day, all of this is really more about the process and less about the product itself. Um, this is not too far removed from teaching math with manipulatives to elementary school kids. Um, Typically, or I mean, my background is I was a music teacher for 10 years prior to doing this sort of work. And each time I would introduce an instrument, I would put aside an entire class period where I just let the kids play so they could get past the novelty and get to the point where they can be creative with it. But the novelty wearing off is tied to actually really sort of losing yourself in the experience and getting used to it and being able to get past the wow factor and get into understanding. All right, great. This is really cool. I really love this. I think this is amazing. Wouldn't it be interesting if I could do X? And being able to tie into the process of asking those questions and digging deeper into curiosity, that goes past the wow factor and the novelty.
Great. And do you think that virtual reality would be useful to teach science, technology, and math in the classroom?
I I've seen it done. We in one of the schools I've worked with, we worked on a project where students built out a VR gallery of the elemental chart. But I would also say, or I would stress that I think VR can be used to teach anything. VR can easily be used to teach any of the humanities classes, especially a character study or something within history, which is heavily dependent on perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And also, what about students who get nauseous because of VR? Because I've been told that, there's this notion of virtual reality sickness. So how do you deal with that in your own classroom?
Well, the way we deal with that in a bunch of ways. For instance, some of the headsets allow you to stream directly to a phone or a tablet, and so while it's not the same experience, and I want to stress in the classroom, it's more about designing it than every kid having to get into a VR headset. That allows students who experience motion sickness to still be a part of the design process, but without having to put a headset on. Another thing that we sort of stress is the amount of time the kids are in headsets. I typically don't ask or allow children, students, to be in headsets for longer than 20 minutes at a time without at least a 30-minute break.
Huh, okay. And do you find that when they go back to like the textbook, do they find it boring having come out of the exciting virtual reality environment?
Well, I try not to think of it as a comparison between the two. That's like asking when you go back to a phone call after doing a Zoom call, is it boring? It's a different medium. You get something different out of it. I don't think the purpose of VR or any sort of technology within the classroom should be to supplant other mediums of learning, but rather to supplement and create another modality for a different type of learner.
Okay, great. And how can virtual reality revolutionize the education system in this COVID-19 era?
That's a good question. And I mean, if this was happening prior to COVID, where VR was just being used to create access. And I think whether it's access to spaces that weren't readily available due to distance. I know initially Google with some of their early products, it was about basically touring museums in different countries or going on virtual field trips. So there's that. But I think at this point, the way the technology has increased, it is also the access has increased to whether it be experts or other teachers or other students. At my current school, we're working on a project where we're trying to create connections between students in the US and students in Israel through VR. A lot of it is just initially when we were working on this prior to COVID, it was just about sharing perspectives. But now, with the amount of countries that are sort of closing their borders in order to battle the COVID issue, COVID crisis, this actually provides connection in a way that isn't different or isn't better, but is different than a phone call or a Zoom.
Yeah, I can see that. But I'm concerned about countries like Africa or marginalized communities. You mentioned earlier that the technology is becoming cheaper, but I still believe it's too expensive for teachers and students in those marginalized communities. What do you think about that?
I think VR, there's a level of VR that's too expensive for marginalized communities here in the States. It is a really small subset of students that have the ability to even experience it or even understand how it works. And so there is, I mean, personally, I'm working with some colleagues on projects that we're looking at this summer to help create that connection and that access to emerging technology like VR. Similarly, last summer, I worked on a project with a friend of mine. Her name is June Beha, and she runs this organization called the Beha Group. And essentially, her organization is centered around, I think at its core, they essentially find grants and help schools obtain that money. But then, additionally, on top of that, beyond just grant writing, they started an internship program within one of these communities here in California. And what we piloted last summer was a remote version of a VR class where all of the kids in the class we met over Zoom, but they all received headsets and they all built out their own VR content. And we basically partnered with this other company called AbeLab, who has this project or this product called Zoe, which allows kids to build VR content within VR without coding. And so the students worked in this project for about 4 weeks, and their final work ended up within the Comic-Con online portal that was built out last year. And the students, we essentially for 3 weeks worked on design. We didn't even touch VR. And in the last week, the students built out the content. And so that prototype allowed us to really sort of think about how we could scale that out to students in a bunch of areas, including we're looking at actually specific countries within Africa. My parents, I don't know if it's obvious to your listeners or your viewers, but my parents are from Ghana. And so that is one of the countries that we're looking at expanding this program to, because we think that access and equity for all types of students only pushes the medium forward, but also innovation globally.
Yeah, great initiative. And based on what you're saying, and I know I asked earlier, but it really seems that design is a core element to understand before you dive into VR. So, is it that you're proposing that students first learn the core elements of design before they even proceed to learning aspects of virtual reality?
I would amend that and say that I think students and adults, everyone should play first. To me,
Mm-hmm.
that's the first step. And then after playing, maybe either work on or develop questions around what they're experiencing, and then based upon those questions, go through the design process. And that, at least this is my process, through that design process and that process of actually building something out, do they learn more about VR, how it can be used effectively, and how they can use it to express themselves or share their stories. You know, similar, you were talking about access and experience. I feel that emerging tech, so XR, so the spectrum, which includes augmented reality and virtual reality, is in its own way the new printing press or the new social media. It's the new, it, it, it has the potential to be the new medium where people can share out their narratives and create this canon that continues within this long line of communication tools.
Great, and I totally agree with you. So, what possibilities are you seeing for the future of virtual reality in the classroom?
Well, if we're going to say short term, it would be using virtual reality to create um, vital and unique learning opportunities within the classroom. But if we're looking more long term, I would say that VR basically redefining what the term classroom even means. Uh, will it mean that you go one place to learn, or that you have access to a series of places from home in the way that we are using Zoom to do the same thing? Like you're in Europe, I'm in Southern California. Um, Typically, this might be a phone call, but we're using Zoom to make it a different type of experience. I feel that VR can do the same thing for education.
Most definitely. And what's your message to educators who would want to adopt virtual reality in their own classroom?
Um, I would say, well, a couple of things. One, I realize that it's a privilege to even be able to use VR, and that there is, whether you're in the States or in Europe, there's money through foundations and grants. I mean, this is something that the process that I'm going through now to work on the project I mentioned earlier about providing access to all students to VR, where you can access those funds to bring the hardware into your classroom. But more importantly than bringing the hardware into your classroom, grounding the use of it into something um, that is engaging to students, but also empowering. How do you create a medium where they can share their work to a larger audience so that they have intrinsic motivation to utilize it? How do you create an experience where students can tell their stories using this medium? How do you create the motivation around building and then layer that with opportunities for them to learn about different topics as opposed to just teaching your topic through that medium? I mean, these are, at the end of the day, how people use VR and with their students is entirely up to them and should be determined by the needs of their students. But those are a few sort of guidelines that I use.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I was looking and also speaking with a lot of educators, and when Zoom came out in the COVID era, they found
Mm-hmm.
it very difficult to adapt and to learn to Zoom. So I can imagine that virtual reality could be quite daunting for these educators. How would you address that? What's your message to them in that regard?
that that is more about a mindset
Yeah.
than the hardware itself or the software or the process. Um, there, if you're adding anything new to your toolbox, there's going to be a level of uncomfortability and a piece where you're not exactly sure what you are doing. So the name of the show has experts in it, and I actually really try hard to steer away from that title. I don't personally consider myself an expert. I consider myself someone who's had a ton of experience with something, but I am constantly learning. And I know so many other educators and people within this space that have a wealth of knowledge that I am still of things I'm still learning about. There are people who are doing amazing things with VR and mindfulness. There's this woman, I'm spacing on her last name, but Caitlin, who's out of the Bay Area, who works at Stanford, who leads these mindful VR tours in products like Engage. There are people who have an amazing understanding of how to shoot film and video and link it together in VR to create these immersive experiences, which I kind of understand. I've had some experience with that, but in no way would I call myself an expert. And so, circling back to your initial question, the advice I would give is don't be afraid to not know what you're doing, which is hard for teachers, especially when you're like, well, I'm going to introduce this to kids and this is really hard. So I need to understand it first so I can teach them. And I've actually learned the most about this medium in working with kids and seeing what they figure out, and not being the person who has to be the expert, but more the person who provides the access to the materials and creates the opportunity for students to fail a little bit, but also to shine and share what they've learned.
Yeah, very beautiful advice. Thanks for sharing, Kwaku.
No problem.
Yes, so thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us on Experts Connect. Thanks for coming today.
No problem. You have a great day.
You too. Cheers. Thanks for tuning in on Experts Connect. Please head on over to teachsomebody.com and give us an applause. You may share your comments and ask your questions in the comment section. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, as well as follow us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. You can also follow me on Instagram at Davis-Owusu. Have a lovely rest of the week. Bye.